Namaskar. Today we will be discussing the next topic in our module on consumer decision making, on psychological influences on consumer decision making, or as we call them, the psychographic influences or the individual determinants on consumer decision making. This particular topic relates to consumer communication. So, we will be talking about module 6.6, which is consumer communication, which we shall be covering in a total of 2 hours. In this particular session and in this particular module, we will be talking about the definition and meaning of consumer communication. We should be discussing the components of the communication process, the marketing communication process, how do we go about designing a communication strategy, integrated marketing communication and models of communication strategy, and finally consumer communication and implications for a marketer. So, this is what we shall be discussing in the next 2 sessions, and for today's session on this particular module 6.6, we shall be discussing the definition and meaning of consumer communication. We will be talking about the components of the communication process. We shall be more specific when we talk about the marketing communication process, and then we shall be talking about how do we go about designing a communication strategy. Now, as far as this last topic is concerned, we will be covering a part of it where we will be talking of certain components or certain elements of a communication strategy, and we shall be covering the rest of the portion or the rest of the next portion in the next session. So, to begin with, we start with the definition and meaning of consumer communication. Now, let us first define what communication is. When we talk about communication, we say it is the flow of information from the sender to the receiver, with the latter having a proper understanding of it. So, it is actually a platform or an exchange process, exchange of ideas, exchange of thoughts, put across as a message which flows from the sender to the receiver. It is encoded or put into some form by the sender, and via a channel it reaches the receiver, who decodes it and and should be able to understand the message as it is meant to be. So, when we define the communication process, we say it is the flow of information from the sender to the receiver, with the latter having a proper understanding of it. Now, to be more specific with respect to marketing communication, we would say that when the flow of information is with respect to a product or service offering from a marketer to the consumer, whether actual or current or prospect, we call it consumer communication. So, it is a flow of information about a product or service offering from the marketer to the consumer. The basic objective of the marketer is to put across a message, either to inform the consumer or make him aware of a product or service offering, or to facilitate recall, or to build up favorable attitudes, or to elicit action. It could be any one of these objectives which is basically put across through a message, and this message flows from the marketer to the consumer, who could be a current or a prospect. Now, in simple words, it is actually the flow of information regarding a product or service offering from the marketer to the consumer. Talking about consumer communication, it could assume 2 forms. The first form is a personal form via interpersonal communication through the marketer and the salesperson or the dealer. So, it is essentially a personal or interpersonal communication that takes place between the marketer and the consumer through the marketer himself or his spokesperson or his dealer or his salesperson. So, it is a personal communication. It's an interpersonal communication that takes place between the marketer and the consumer via the marketer himself, or through his salespeople, or through his dealers, or through other agents. So, this is what we refer to as personal or via interpersonal communication. There is also another mode. There is also another mode through which communication could flow, and this is the impersonal or the impersonal communication, which takes place via a channel. Now, the channel could be either in the form of a print media or an audio visual media. So, it's essentially impersonal in nature via a channel or a media. Now, marketers basically make use of their communication mix or their promotion mix, which comprises advertisement, sales, promotion, personal selling, direct marketing and publicity, to communicate with the customers. So marketers make use of their communication mix or the promotion mix to communicate or to put forward what they want to say to the consumers. They inform the consumers, both current consumers and actual consumers, about the product or service offering. They inform them about any changes brought about in the product or service offering or in the marketing mix. So the marketer here tries to inform the consumer, tries to make them aware. The consumers also keep themselves involved. They keep themselves informed about what is happening, both through the marketer's efforts as well as through informal interpersonal communication that takes place between consumers themselves, or between a actual and a prospect, or the kind of communication they have with their family, with their friends, with their colleagues, or their opinion leaders via informal sources of communication. So, while the marketer puts in a lot of effort to educate the consumers about the product or service offering, about the brands, about the marketing mix, or about changes brought about in the marketing mix, the consumers also keep themselves informed via interpersonal communication, which is informal in nature, either through their friends or through colleagues or through opinion leaders, or the informal sources. So the consumers basically have on the one hand a formal communication from a formal marketing communication directly from the marketer or via a channel. On the other hand, they also have an interpersonal communication which is very informal with their social group. Now both the sources from the formal from the marketer as well as informal through friends, colleagues, or word of mouth have an important role to play in communication. So this particular process here, where the marketer tries to educate the consumers, try to make aware the consumers about the product or service offering, about the brand, about the marketing mix, or about any of these changes, is put across either through his own efforts, which could be personal via interpersonal, or it could be something which is impersonal via a channel. Consumers also have another source of informal interpersonal communication through word of mouth. So consumers keep themselves informed about both these sources. Now let us come to the components of the communication process. If you see, we can depict it through a model here, where there are three major components of the communication process. You have the sender, you have the receiver, and there is a media. Now apart from the sender and apart from the receiver and the media, there are two other elements in the communication process. We could say there are two subcomponents of the communication process. One is feedback and the other is noise. So you have three basic components in the form of the sender, the receiver, and the channel, and you have two sub-processes or sub-components in the form of the feedback and noise. So message here is encoded by the sender. It's transmitted via a media or a channel. It is decoded by the receiver, and this receiver provides some kind of a feedback which will ensure whether a message has been understood in the manner in which it is intended to do so, or any kind of reactions which come from the receiver act as a feedback and to the sender, whether the objective of the communication has been accomplished or not. Any kind of clarifications, etc., sought by the receiver are again brought back as a feedback to the sender. Now at every stage of this process, right from the sender to his encoding, to the channel, to the decoding, to the receiver, at any of these there could be certain kinds of disturbances which could be either external or internal. External in the environment, internal to the receiver, which could act as elements we call as noise. So when the communication could get impacted by a disturbance, we refer to it as a noise. Now noise here could be external to the environment in the form of a loud bang or a loud noise, There are also disturbances which occur internally between within the sender himself or within the receivers, and these are referred to as internal disturbances. So both internal and external disturbances act as a noise element. So if you see here, there is a message which is, there is a source here who has something to say, so he encodes the message. A message, encoded message via a channel reaches the receiver, who decodes the message and has tries to understand the message and reacts with a feedback. So you have the source here. The purpose of communication expressed as a message emanates from this particular sender or from this particular source. He will encode the message either with words or pictures or gestures, and through that he will transmit them via a channel or via a media. Thus, the particular message consists of subject matter that the sender intends to transmit to the receiver, and it could take any of the forms. It could take an oral form or it could take a written form. It could be in the form of words or pictures or images or even gestures. Then you have after the encoding is over, the message is put across through a channel or the media. So the media here or the channel is through which the information is transmitted. As we just discussed, communication could be impersonal via a print media or an audiovisual media, or it could be also interpersonal directly with the marketer through the salesperson or his dealer. So it could be both interpersonal and impersonal. It is interpersonal when people are going to act face to face by talking and listening, and the air and sound waves constitute the media. On the other hand, it will be impersonal when the communication will take place through a channel, which could be a print media or newspapers, brochures or magazines, or it could be a broadcast media, audiovisual in the form of TV, radio, websites, etc. So this is what you have as a channel. Now the message is transmitted via the channel and it reaches the receiver, who is going to decode it. He will now decode the particular message to extract meaning out of it. Now at this particular stage, when you are talking about decoding, two errors can take place. One is amplification and the second is leveling. Amplification happens when people add up to the message and exaggerate it. So when they add up more, you can say mirch masala to a message, and they exaggerate the message, they add much more than what was essentially being said or intended to be said. We call it the amplification effect. On the other hand, we have the leveling effect, which is the opposite of amplification, and it occurs when the receiver erases or deletes a part or whole of the message. So that particular phenomena is referred to as leveling. So after the receiver has properly decoded the message, he should have had an understanding of it, and he reacts with a feedback. Now when the message moves forward from the sender to the receiver, the feedback moves backward from the receiver to the sender. And so there is a feedback loop. It reflects whether the message has been properly understood by the receiver or not. It is also a means by which a sender gets to know or gets to understand the reaction of the receiver. We also have an element here which is noise, which I just said can affect each and every stage of the communication process. It is anything that disturbs or interferes with the communication process. It acts as a barrier to the communication process, and it could be internal or external. It is internal when it concerns the sender or the receiver, who are not paying much attention to encoding or to decoding because they are preoccupied with something else, or something is bothering them. So because of that, because of improper encoding and improper decoding, it leads to an erroneous communication. On the other hand, noise could also be external, where there is a disturbance in the environment in the form of a loud sound, or when there is a problem with the channel or the media, sound waves or poor reception of signal, etc. So this is what we mean by the feedback. So this is what this is what we mean by noise. So this is what a normal communication process is. It starts with a sender who has something to say. it is this particular, it is the sender is going to determine what he must say, and that is what he encodes either through oral or written communication, through words, through gestures, through images, or through body language, and that gets transmitted via a channel which could be either interpersonal or an impersonal channel. Interpersonal, when people are talking face to face with each other, it is interpersonal, and impersonal channels are in the form of the print media or the broadcast audiovisual media. And this particular encoded message via the channel reaches the receiver, and the receiver is going to decode it. At this particular stage, errors like amplification and leveling will take place, could take place, and finally the receiver reacts with a feedback, which is actually a signal to, it gives a signal, it gives an indication to the sender that the message has been properly received or accurately received and understood or not. There are noise at every level, whether internal or external. Internal is when it relates to a sender or a receiver, and because of preoccupation with something else, or because of certain tensions or anxieties, they are unable to either first encode and then decode the message improperly, both with respect to the sender and the receiver respectively. So, because of this, there is an erroneous communication. So, these are internal factors relating to noise. Noise could also be external when it is a loud sound, or there are problems with the signal, or or with the media itself. So, here is what we mean by this entire process, which we refer to as the communication process. Now, let us come to the marketing communication process. As we just said, the marketing communication is the transmission of a message from the marketer to the consumer via a media. Now, what could be the basic objectives of communication? The basic objectives of communication could be: one, inform the consumer about a product or service offering, or about the marketing mix. To not only inform the consumer, but also inform the prospect. So, it is both current and prospects. You try to inform them about a product or service offering or about a brand. To make them aware about the product or service offering and about the mix. How is it better? What is it in it that is a value proposition? How is it unique? How is it better than the competitors? What are the basic features? What is the price, or what are the deals? So, you try to make him aware about the product and the mix. Then you also tend to have another objective to build a favorable attitude for your product or service offering in the minds of the consumer. So, another object or another motive for any marketer to communicate with the customer is to not only inform him or make him aware, but also to develop a positive attitude for his brand, develop a feeling of likingness, or develop a feeling of favorableness towards the brand. And fourthly, try to elicit an action, try to elicit some form of an action on the part of the consumer. So, this means trying to encourage a purchase. So, the basic objective of a marketing communication is to inform a consumer, make him aware of the product or service offering, build a favorable attitude, and encourage a purchase. Now, let us talk about the process from the point of view of marketing communication. So, we will talk about all of these: the sender, the receiver, the media. We will be talking about all these things in the context of marketing. So, let us first talk about the sender. Now, the sender here is basically the initiator. He is the one who is going to initiate a message, and he is also referred to as the message initiator or the source. Now, in the context of marketing management and consumer behavior, the sender could be a formal source or an informal source. A formal source includes the company, which is the marketer himself, or both public and private sector organizations, those working not for profit as well as working for profit. So, formal sources could be any kind of a marketer, whether working for profit or not for profit, whether public sector organizations or private sector organizations. Now, it could also mean commercial organizations, government organizations, or even NGOs. So these are the formal sources of communication, and you have the informal source of communication, which we all know is through the word of mouth, which includes families, friends, peers, colleagues, people in our reference group who provide us with a lot of information about their experiences or about their knowledge with respect to product or service category or about the mix. So you have these two sources as a part of the sender. The sender here is the initiator. He is the initiator of the message. He is the source of the message, and these sources could be either formal in nature or informal in nature. Now, research has shown that there is greater reliability, there is greater credibility associated with informal sources of communication than with formal source of communication. So, consumers rely more on informal source of communication, be it friends, family, peers, colleagues, other people in your reference group, even opinion leaders. This is essentially because it is believed that such people, such informal sources do not have any ulterior motive. While a marketer has a motive that he wants to, sell his product, he wants to talk favorably about his product because he wants to sell his product, earn revenue, earn profit. So there is a motive associated with the communication message and the communication strategy. But for the informal sources, it is believed that they are more credible, they are more reliable because they do not have any ulterior motive, or they do not have any motive associated with why they are saying what they want to say. So unlike the marketer who comprises the formal source, the informal sources are more reliable. Nevertheless, we also give a lot of importance to the marketer and the way he communicates. Now, the sender here will decide what to say, whether the sender be a formal source or an informal source, will actually decide what to say, how to say, where to put it across through. So how to say, when to say, where to say, and what to say. Now, any case, basically his objective is to provide, whether it is an informal or a formal source, the main objective is to provide information with respect to the product or service offering or the brand, and anything and everything with respect to the 4 Ps. So we come to the next thing, which is message and encoding. So once the sender has decided what he wants to communicate, he encodes the message, he encodes the information into a message. Now, the sender here will think, basically decide what to say, how to say it logically, how to say it symbolically, and who is to say. So what to say, who will say, how will it be said logically, how will it be conveyed symbolically. All of these are decisions which the sender is going to take. So the sender here, meaning the marketer or it's through the marketer, he is going to decide what should he be saying about his product or service offering or his brand, how should he be saying it logically, how should he be saying symbolically, and who is going to be his audience, or who is the message meant for. So message here is illustrative of the content, and includes the physical format through words, which is the verbal communication, the symbols, the pictures and the images, which is the visual communication, and the gestures, which are the non-verbal communication. So, here he has to decide on the verbal, the visual and the non-verbal communication. So, what to say, how to say it logically, how to say it symbolically, and whom am I going to say it, all this is basically going to be major decisions what he has to take. And the message here it should be something which is either could assume a form which is either visual or verbal or non-verbal. So visual is in terms of pictures, images or gestures. Verbal is in terms of words and sentences, and gestures is in the form of the body language or the non-verbal communication. Now, once he decides what he wants to say, how he wants to say, and he encodes the message either through words or through pictures or through gestures. Now, the two things which come in here, the message content and the message context. It's very important here to say that when we are talking about a message content, it is essentially going to be more rational, more factual, And again, we could relate it to the left side of the brain. We could relate it to higher need for customers who have a higher need for cognition. We could very importantly relate it to high involvement products and high involvement purchases. On the other hand, when we are talking of the message context, we are essentially talking of the emotions, the feelings, the fun, the fantasy, the hedonism, and here we could relate it to the right side of the brain, and very importantly to low involvement purchases. So, when we are talking about the content, it is more to do with information and facts, the high involvement product, high involvement purchase situations, and high involvement media, which is essentially the print media, and the central route to persuasion and the left side of the brain. On the other hand, when we are talking about the message context, we are talking about emotions, which is low involvement products, low involvement purchase situations, the peripheral route to persuasion, low involvement media, which is essentially through broadcast, audiovisual, TV. And so herein lies the difference, and what we say, how we are going to say it, will basically depend upon decisions with respect to whether the product is high involving or low involving, and the kind of segment, whether need for cognition is high or need for cognition is low. Accordingly, we decide on the channel whether it would be a high involvement media or a low involvement media. So, both when we are trying to say something logically or symbolically, we are going to take decisions with respect to the message strategy, and the message strategy here will deal with the message content and the message context. Now, whatever the marketer will basically encode the message, and he must do so in a manner which is appropriately and very accurately understood by the segment or by the majority of the customers or the majority of the audience for whom the message is designed. So, keeping in mind the issues have to be kept in mind, with decisions have to be taken with respect to the message strategy, how to say it, what appeals to use, so that, and how to say it in a simpler way, so that the message goes across to the consumer and he understands the message as it is designed to be. So, this is with respect to the decisions which are taken by the sender. Now, the message could be verbal or non-verbal or a mix of two, as we just said. It could be a visual or a verbal or a non-verbal. Verbal is basically best suited for a factual or an emotion, for a factual or an informational appeal. So, you provide a lot of information with respect to the product or service offering. You talk about product attributes, benefits, features. You talk about how it is a better value proposition than other alternative brands. So, it is best, a verbal message is best suited for factual or informational appeals. The verbal message is combined with audiovisual demonstration or with symbolic non-verbal means for creating greater impact, for generating greater emotions amongst consumers. So, both verbal and non-verbal go together to create a long lasting impact, which could be both rational and emotional. So, the marketer here basically has to decide whether he is going to use verbal and non-verbal or mix of both. Of course, verbal is blended with non-verbal, and the both of them put together create lead to not only lead to rationality or rational appeals as well as emotional appeals, which have a longer lasting effect on the consumer, not only in terms of information gathering or storage or retrieval, but also better recall. So, the marketer also has to make decisions with respect to what channel he is going to use, whether he is going to put it in the print media or he is going to be put it in broadcast audiovisual media. And of course, he can make use of celebrities. Now, when we are talking about celebrities, or when we are talking about experts, we will also talk about the credibility of such celebrities and such spokesperson a little later. But before that, we would like to mention something about the credibility of the source itself. Now, the credibility of the source here meaning either the marketer or his spokesperson, affects the manner in which the target audience will decode the message. When the spokesperson has some expert power, he is an expert, he is very knowledgeable in a particular product or service category, or he is an expert, or he has some charismatic power, or he holds a position of legitimacy. the influence that he'll be able to gain is going to be much higher. The influence that he'll be able to generate will be much higher. Let's take an example here that when a person you use a person as a spokesperson in your advertisement who is a doctor or who is a very successful dietitian, the impact that they will create through their message will be much higher. They'll be able to influence consumers much more easily than other people. So very usage of very successful doctors or very successful architects or very successful nutritionist experts or anybody who's an expert or in a particular area. If you use him as a spokesperson, the level of influence that they generate is much higher. Similarly, there are people who have charismatic power. They're very good looking, or they have a very good physique or a physical appearance, or they're very attractive. So such people who have a level of charisma also are more influential or are more stronger in terms of sending across a message. The likelihood of their impacting other people becomes much higher. And of course, if people hold a position of legitimacy, like we have this example of Tata Nano, where just before its launch and immediately after it coming into the market, there was Ratan Tata who was speaking very favorably about it, not only in press releases or in through publicity or public relation campaigns, but also through the advertisements on TV. So the influence he was able to generate on the masses that yes, a car for rupees 1 lakh will be made and will be available. So it basically, because Ratan Tata was saying something like this, people began to believe him, and people began to believe that yes, a car worth rupees 1 lakh could be available. So the influence that such people are able to gain is much higher. Now, the consumer also regards the source to be credible when he feels that the source has some expertise or will provide unbiased information or is trustworthy or is credible. So the receivers also respect such a source who they feel are have an expertise or are trustworthy or are credible. When a particular source is held in a lot of respect or esteem, when a source is regarded as credible or very honest or very sincere, the probability of a message being assimilated or being believed by the target audience becomes very high, and vice versa. So when your source is credible, when he is regarded as honest, sincere, or he is looked up with a lot of respect and esteem, so the probability of the message being assimilated is much higher. Now, let us talk a little bit about credibility of sources. When we talk about credibility, it's important both for formal and informal sources. When we talk of the formal sources, the credibility of formal sources is a cumulative of one, the reputation of the company, the reputation of the brand, the marketer, his performance and his social responsibility. So one is the credibility of the source, or we're talking of formal sources. The first thing that comes in is the reputation of the marketer, of the company, of the brand, his contribution to society, his contribution to the environmental issues, and his performance in the market, his performance as in the market as well as part of social responsibility. The second thing is, which adds to the reputation of or the credibility of formal sources, is the credibility of the source or the spokesperson himself. So as we just said, that if a person is an expert or if a person holds some level of charisma, or holds a legitimate position because he is a company spokesperson. So anybody could be a celebrity or an expert or a company representative, or anybody who acts as a spokesman will add to the credibility of the formal source. The credibility of a formal source is also based on the reputation of the dealer or of the shopkeeper. So that is the reason why companies are very careful while selecting or while creating their dealer network. So when we talk about the credibility of the source, it's also a function of the credibility of the dealer or of the reputation of the shopkeeper who stocks the merchandise and sells it. Another factor which leads to the credibility of the source is the channel through which it is aired. So, you have certain channels which are looked up with lot of lot of respect, or they are looked up in high esteem. So, if you are able to advertise your product or service offering, or if you are able to talk about your product or service offering through such sources, it adds to your reputation. Especially you have reviews, or you have editorial columns, and if your brand figures in editorial columns or reviews in certain kinds of newspapers or on certain kinds of channels, then that also acts as leads to credibility of the source. And the consumer's own experience, also hearsay of others' experiences and word of mouth also add to the credibility of the formal source. So, if we if we sum it up, the credibility of the formal source depends upon, one, the marketer himself, the company, their performance and their role as in corporate social responsibility; two, the spokesperson or the person who is putting across the message, the celebrity or the expert or a company spokesperson; three, the reputation of the dealer or the storekeeper or the shopkeeper who is going to stock the merchandise and sell it; four, the reputation of the channel where or the media through which it is going to go across; and five, the personal experience of the customer himself, either his own experiences or hearsay and word of mouth and other people's experiences. So, this is what actually will determine the credibility of a formal source. Talking about credibility of informal sources, people often rely on their friends, on their family, on their colleagues, on their work peers, on the opinion leaders for a lot of advice, for a lot of information about product or service offerings. They seek information from them. They have a lot of discussions with respect to such products or services, and they share their information, they share their experiences with each other. Credibility of such sources is higher because it is believed that informal sources do not have any ulterior motive. They have nothing to gain out of information sharing or out of any form of communication. Opinion leaders also have a very big role to play. People approach opinion leaders for product news, advice, information, sharing of experiences, and such opinion leaders also provide a lot of information to those who approach them. Okay, one thing which we would like to mention here is that while we say that informal sources do not have anything to gain, and so the kind of communication that takes place between within informal sources is supposed to be much higher, the exceptions are always there. Like we have seen, there is a lot of research which has been conducted, and we often see it in our day-to-day lives also, that very often a person A who has bought a product and he is experiencing a cognitive dissonance will convince person B to also to buy the product, so that once B buys the product, the cognitive level of A automatically gets reduced. So in order to reduce their own discomfort, their own anxiety, their own tensions, their own cognitive dissonance, they may refer a product or service or a brand to another. So over there, it may happen that we could say that there is a motive on the part of an informal source, but they convince their friends also to buy the product or service which they have purchased, so that cognitive dissonance is reduced. So while we say that informal sources have nothing to gain, but exceptions could always be there, and there could be a hidden agenda where a person is convincing another to buy something because he himself has bought it earlier and wants the other to buy it as well. And so such sources here may not always be credible and trustworthy, and actually if this happens very often, then the particular friend or that particular colleague ceases to be, ceases to be accepted as a information provider in future. A person B, when he buys something and realizes it was faulty, so he'll never go back to person A again for help or for advice with respect to a product or a purchase of a particular product. So we talk about the credibility of the source, and this credibility of the source has a big role to play in the manner in which consumer is going to decode the message. When we see that there is a person who's saying something either because of his expertise or his knowledge or his experience or his being a legitimate spokesperson, the level of credibility associated with the message will be very, very high, and consumers, will rely generally on such credible sources. Now let us come to the second second component, which is media. So as we said earlier, the media is the channel that exists between the sender and the receiver. So sender here meaning the marketer, and the receiver here being the consumer. So the channel here could be interpersonal and impersonal channels through which he can transmit his message to the consumer. Talking about interpersonal channels, as we just said, it is a face-to-face contact between the salesperson or the dealer and the customer, and it is generally face-to-face, but it could also be through telephone or through email. But it is a communication that takes place between two people. We call it interpersonal communication. It could also be between two friends or between a customer and a prospect, and in the form of a word of mouth. So this is what we mean by interpersonal sources, and then or interpersonal channels. And then we have the impersonal channels or the impersonal media, which basically includes communication that takes place via print media, newspapers, magazines, brochures, or via broadcast audiovisual media, that is TV, radio, etc. And the message, as we just discussed, could be either a verbal message in the form of words, it could be a non-verbal message in the form of body language and gestures, or it could be a visual message in the form of pictures or images or symbols. So here is what we mean by interpersonal and impersonal channels. Now just as we associate credibility with the sender, similarly we also associate a credibility with the channel. The reputation of the channel that carries the message also affects the credibility of the source and the credibility of the message. In case it is an interpersonal channel, the communication takes place between the marketer, that is the spokesperson, and the dealer and the consumer, so or who could be an actual consumer or a prospect. So the credibility here, in terms of the reputation, the trustworthiness related to the dealer or to the spokesperson will affect the credibility of the source, will affect the credibility affect the credibility of the source, which is credibility of the medium, which is interpersonal medium, and so it will have an impact on the credibility of the message being passed through a channel and assimilated by the consumer. So in case it's an interpersonal channel where a communication takes place between the salesperson or the dealer and the customer, the honesty, integrity of the salesperson adds to the credibility. In case it's an impersonal communication, messages will be channeled, they'll be played through the print media or through the audiovisual media, and there again some kinds of newspapers or some kinds of channels are reputed, they are given star ratings, or they are given some kind of accreditations to them, some kind of they associated with some kind of legitimacy or some kind of trustworthiness. So if you're going to air, or if you're going to play your message or air your message through or print your message through such channels, the credibility of the message will increase. So also we have seen that any kind of message which is put across through trade journals or special interest magazines are regarded as more credible than sources which are put across in audiovisual media. And the reputation of the spokesperson in the ad also leads to the credibility. So that is how, and this is what suggests the importance of testimonials which are provided by a lot of people in print or on through the broadcast media. So the credibility here of the medium is also very important, which is going to have an impact on the credibility of the marketer, of the message of the marketer and of the company. So the channel through which you are going to air, whether interpersonal or impersonal, is also going to have an impact on the credibility of the marketer or of the credibility of the sender. Now here this is what brings us to the third component, which is the receiver. So the message is received by the receiver or the target audience. Now it is this target audience here is our consumer, who could be an actual or who could be a prospect, and he will decode the message. Now while the message is meant for while the message is meant for people for our target, while the message is meant for our target segment, while it is meant for customers who may be either current customers or potential customers, or current customers or prospects, very often the message gets exposed to many other people who are referred to as who are audiences for whom the message is not meant for. Such audience are referred to as intermediary audience and the unintended audiences. So while the message is meant for current and prospective customers, there are other elements also who get exposed, and such people are known as intermediary audiences and unintended audiences. Now, what are intermediary audiences? Intermediary audiences could be channel members, that is members of your marketing channel or your trade channel, in the form of your wholesalers or your dealers or your retailers or your stockists, and they could also be professionals in the form of architects or doctors or professors, etc. So when we talk about doctors or architects or professors, that becomes more specific to a product category. Okay, like for example, there may be a product which is used by the consumer, by the buyer, who is referred to by another person, like we call it missionary selling. A doctor prescribes a medicine and the patient goes and buys the medicines, or the professor prescribes a book and the student goes and buys the book. So it's not the doctor or the professor who is actually buying it, is they are recommending it or they are prescribing it to another to the actual customer or the actual user. So for such cases, for advertisement for a particular medicine or for a particular book, the doctor and the teacher respectively, or the professor respectively, become the unintended audiences. Okay, so the message is not meant for these people. These people are just going to act as a via media. Similarly, you have the dealers or the retailers or the stockists, and the message is, the ad is not meant for them. They are already aware about your product or about your offering. You have also already informed them through trade advertising also, or through, they've informed them through about certain schemes or certain changes in the mix. You've informed them beforehand via other information provided to them. So this particular ad is actually not meant for such people. So we call them unintended audiences. So next we come to the third component, which is receiver. So the message here is received by the target audience. In this context, the target audience here becomes the receiver. Now this target audience or receiver or people in our consumer segment could be actual consumers or could be prospects. So while the message is meant for consumers who are either actual consumers or prospects, or either actual consumers or potential, this message also gets exposed to many other people for whom it is not meant. Such people are referred to as what we call as intermediary audiences or unintended audiences. So the message is actually meant for the customer, either the actual customer or the prospect, but this message or this ad is also exposed to many others for whom it is actually not meant. So such people are called the intermediary audience and the unintended audiences. Now let us discuss what an intermediary audience is. Intermediary audiences are a part of your trade channel, they are a part of your marketing channel, they are in the form of your wholesalers, your dealers, your stockists or your retailers. Now such people you have already informed such people about your product or service offering, or about the price, or about the various schemes. You have informed them beforehand about all this through information having gone through to them through documents or through brochures or through company salespeople having gone and educated them. So the particular message which you are beaming through the print or the audiovisual media is actually not meant for these people, because they are already aware of your product. So we call them the intermediary audience. Other examples of intermediary audience are people like architects or doctors or even professors. This can be explained in the context of missionary selling. Let's take a doctor. He prescribes a medicine to a patient and the patient goes and buys it. Or there is a professor who prescribes a book to a student and the student goes and buys it. Now, neither the doctor nor the professor are actual buyers. They are going to recommend it, or they are going to prescribe it to the doctor is going to recommend it, to prescribe it to a patient, the professor is going to recommend it to a student. So they are going to prescribe it or recommend it to people who are going to go and buy it. So we call this kind of selling as missionary selling, where the people like doctors or the teachers are going to be informed beforehand by people from the company or from the medical company or from the publishing house about a particular medicine or about a particular book. So these medical representatives or these people from the publishing house are going to educate the doctor or the teacher about the medicine or about the book, and these people are then going to prescribe it. So these are cases of what we call as missionary selling. So in the case of missionary selling also, when the architects or when the doctors or when the teachers have been educated beforehand, say the doctor has been educated about a tablet or a medicine and has been made aware of a particular molecule or a new brand. Similarly, a teacher or a professor has already been made aware of a newly launched book. So such people do not need any kind of exposure to a new ad, but nevertheless they are still exposed to the ad. So we call them as intermediary audiences. There are also certain things called as, or certain audience called as unintended audience. Now what is the unintended audience? Talking about unintended audience are people who are various kinds of stakeholders. They could be shareholders of your company, they could be bankers, they could be suppliers, they could be publics, and any and all of these. So you have these people who are unintended audiences. Now the receiver, the message is decoded by the receiver, and again we talk of credibility. The message from the marketer is decoded by the consumer. The credibility of the message will get impacted by how well it is comprehended by the receiver himself. So the comprehending and the understanding of the message will be based upon the message itself, the person's characteristics, his experiences, his background, his motivation, his moods, his emotions, his involvement, his attitude, perception, personality, his ability to process, and the impact of social forces. So so we have here the receiver himself, who because of his characteristics will also impact the credibility of the message, and so far as understanding of the message and comprehension of the message is concerned. It has been seen that receivers expose themselves selectively to media as well as to messages. This is called selective exposure or selective attention. They flip over pages in a newspaper or in a magazine. They miss out on advertisements or editorials or testimonials. They just get attracted to certain kinds of things which they want to see or which they want to read or which are more relevant to them, and skip over the others. We have already discussed this when we did perceptual selectivity. So they also in terms of channel or in terms of television, they wander across channels on the TV and on the radio. So they may change channels very frequently. We call it, to see what is coming elsewhere, we call it wandering. They mute the TV when ads are being played, we call it zapping. And they may change the channel when the advertisement being played begins being played to see what program is being played elsewhere. So we call it surfing. Also, marketers try to overcome this problem of channel switching by coming up with something which is called roadblock-ins, where they are playing the same ad across two channels at the same point of time. So the consumer is forcibly exposed to that particular message. The decoding of the message is also affected by noise. Noise, as we see, we have discussed earlier. Now, when we talk about the advertisement, is something which we would like to speak of, which is in terms of the repetition. Repetition can lead to boredom and monotony. So marketers basically have to think about cosmetic variation and substantive variation in their ads. They also use techniques like subverting and forcing. Subverting is presenting something very pleasant or charming, or unpleasant or ugly, so as to catch a consumer by surprise. And jolting is introducing a teaser element. So they say 10 days left, 9 days left, 8 days left. So trying to create an interest in the minds of the consumer. Finally, we have feedback, which is the receiver's response to the sender. And it is basically an acid test to see whether the communication has been effective or not. And it is crucial in both interpersonal and impersonal communications. Of course, it's more easier to read in case of interpersonal communication rather than on impersonal communication. Now, this brings us to designing a communication strategy. So, the basic objective, as we have said earlier, is to inform a consumer, make him aware about a product or service offering, build a favorable attitude and encourage a purchase. And in order to do this, a marketer has to very judiciously decide on his communication strategy or on the use of his promotion mix. So, he must take decisions on 1, the objectives of the communication, 2, the target audience, 3, the message, 4, the media, and 5, the feedback. So, these are certain things which he has to take care of, and we will be discussing some of these just now, and we will continue with it in the next session. So the marketer has to talk about the objective of the communication, the target audience, the media, the message, and the feedback. 1, about the message, decisions have to be taken with respect to what is going to be the communication strategy, what is going to be my objective, make him aware of the product or service offering, create a favorable attitude in the minds of the consumer, or elicit an action or a purchase. So, what is going to be my objective? The target audience here is for whom am I going to say this, or who is my audience? The message and the media strategy, both the message strategy and the media strategy have to be decided. Decisions with respect to media and message strategy have to be taken by keeping the target audience in mind. The media here is decisions have to be taken with respect to the media, we call it the media strategy. So, the media strategy relates to the issue as to which medium to be used and the timing and the location of the message for maximum impact. So, what is going to be my media, and how am I going to time my message, and how frequently I am going to play my message so that it is most effectively accepted. So, here we are talking of the timing and location of the message to have maximum impact. Now, that will depend upon the product or service offering, about the target audience and the communication objective. We have 2 things here which we refer to as reach and frequency. So, the reach here is the number of people who are being exposed to a particular message, and the frequency is how often are they being exposed to the message. So, in order to have a wide reach and frequency, agencies develop what is referred to as a consumer profile and an audience profile. The consumer profile is a description of the consumers who are likely to buy the product or service offering. Okay, so they have the income, they have the access and the desire. An audience profile is the media agency's description about what kind of consumers who read or watch or hear their print and audiovisual channels. Like, for example, you have a magazine like a product like Vardhaman Wool. Okay, now the consumer here is a lady, is majorly a housewife or a homemaker, and she could be a middle-aged lady or an elderly lady. So she is the one, a middle class income group who is a homemaker or she's a housewife, and she is going to be the consumer. The audience profile is in terms of the magazine, like like for example, particular kind of magazines which she would be using, which could be be a Sarita or a Greh Shobha. So if Vardhaman wants to put an ad, it has to match the consumer profile with the audience profile. It has to see what kind of segment is buying its wool, and that particular segment, what is the kind of channels they are viewing, or print magazines or print media they are referring to. So you match the consumer and the audience profile to have a maximum reach in terms of maximum number of households to which you can expose the message, maximum number of customers to whom you can expose the message, and frequency, how frequently, or how many times you can expose your message to them. So here we could basically in order to gain maximum benefit out of reach, there has to be a fit between the audience profile and the consumer profile. Now we will stop here, and this basically brings us to a conclusion of our session, for today's session. Before we move on, let us go to the references. So these are the references, and the frequently asked questions: discuss the credibility of the source in marketing communication, and discuss marketing communication. So a self-evaluation test and a quiz, section 8, true, false. 1, noise in communication is always external. Is it a true or a false statement? This is a false statement. 2, amplification occurs when the receiver deletes or erases part or whole of the message. This is again a false statement. It is not amplification, but it is leveling. 3, the consumer profile refers to media agencies' description about the kind of consumers who read, hear, or watch their print and audiovisual channels. This is again a false statement. It's not the consumer profile, but it is the audience profile. Fill in the blanks. 1, communication could be interpersonal as well as dash. The answer is impersonal. 2, the dash channel includes communication that takes place between the salesperson, dealer, and a customer, either face to face or on telephone or on email. The interpersonal communication. Dash refers to suddenly presenting something that is pleasant, charming, or unpleasant, ugly, so as to catch the consumer by surprise. This is subverting. Decisions related to the objectives of the communication, the target audience, comprise what is known as the dash strategy. It is known as the communication strategy, and dash implies the number of people or households who are exposed to the message because they read the newspaper or watch the program on TV. So it's called reach. So the first answer is impersonal, second answer is interpersonal, third is subverting, fourth is communication, and fifth is reach. Multiple choice questions. 1, the credibility of the source begins to fade away after a period of time. This has been referred to as the A, sleeper effect, B, leveling, C, amplification, D, none of the above. So it's called A, sleeper effect. 2, marketers play their respective advertisements simultaneously across many channels at the same time so that the consumer is forcibly exposed to the advertisement. This is referred to as dash. A, subverting, B, jolting, C, roadblockings, D, grazing. So it's referred to as road block-ins. We call it road block-ins. The short answers: define marketing communication. So you'll 2, mention the 5 tools of the promotion mix. 3, mention the 3 components of the communication process. 4, mention 3 examples of unintended audiences. 5, what could be the objectives of communication. 6, what does the media strategy relate to? So this brings us to a conclusion of this particular session. We shall be continuing with consumer communication in the next session. Thank you.